I didn't build houses. I made sure the deed was clean before anyone signed for one. My monitor was beeping at 62 beats a minute when my daughter's name lit up my phone. Dad, Michelle said. Grant listed the house. It's already under contract. I had been out of surgery for 11 hours. If you're watching this, tell me where in the world you're listening from and hit subscribe, because you are not going to believe what my son-in-law overlooked. Let me back up and tell you exactly how a man barely conscious in a cardiac ward found out his own home was being sold out from under him. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 68 years old, and for 34 years I worked as a title examiner in Cuyahoga County, Ohio. If you don't know what that job is, here's the short version. Before any house changes hands, before any bank hands over a mortgage, somebody has to go back through decades of deeds, liens, judgments, and signatures to make sure the chain of ownership doesn't have a broken link anywhere in it. One missing signature, one improperly notarized document from 40 years ago, and the whole sale can collapse. I spent my career finding those broken links. People used to joke that I could smell a bad signature from across the room. They weren't entirely wrong. I tell you this now because it matters. It matters more than anything else in this story. 3 weeks ago, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when my chest seized up like someone had reached in and closed a fist around it. I don't remember calling 911. I remember the paramedic's face leaning over me in the ambulance, and I remember waking up 2 days later in a recovery room with a tube taped to the back of my hand and a nurse telling me I'd had a triple bypass. My wife, Eleanor, had passed away 2 years earlier from ovarian cancer, so there was no one sitting beside that hospital bed when I opened my eyes. My daughter Michelle came by the second day, stayed for 11 minutes, and left. My son-in-law Grant didn't come at all. I want to be fair here because fairness was the whole discipline of my career. Grant is not a stupid man. He's 39 years old. He runs a small real estate flipping outfit out of a strip mall office, and he has always had the kind of confidence that makes people assume he knows what he's doing. He married my daughter 9 years ago. I walked her down the aisle myself, in the backyard of the house. Eleanor and I built with our own hands in 1988, the house where Michelle grew up, the house where Eleanor took her last breath in the downstairs bedroom because she wanted to die looking out at her garden instead of at a hospital ceiling. That house was never for sale. Not to Grant, not to anyone. It never occurred to me I'd have to say that out loud, because I assumed some things were simply understood between family. I was wrong about that, and I paid for being wrong with 11 days in a hospital bed, while the wrong I never saw coming grew teeth. On day 4 of my recovery, still hooked to a monitor that traced every irregular beat of a heart that had just been cracked open and stitched back together, my phone buzzed on the tray table beside my water cup. It was Michelle. Her voice had that particular brightness people use when they're delivering bad news and trying to make it sound like good news. "Dad, I don't want you to stress about anything," she said. "Grant's just been handling things. He talked to a realtor. We think it's smart to simplify. Sell the house, get you into a nice single-floor place near us, something with no stairs, no yard work. You don't need that whole property anymore, not after this." I lay there with the monitor beeping steadily beside me and asked her to repeat herself because I wanted to hear the words a second time before I let myself react to them. She repeated them. Sell the house. Already talked to a realtor. Already handling things. "Michelle," I said, keeping my voice as flat and even as I could manage with a chest full of stitches, "who signed anything?" There was a pause on the line. The kind of pause where you can hear someone deciding how much truth to give you. "Grant has that power of attorney from when Mom was sick," she finally said. "The one you signed so someone could make decisions if you couldn't. He just used that. It's fine, Dad. It's completely legal. I want you to understand something about that document, because it's the first loose thread in this whole affair, and Grant pulled on it without ever checking where the other end was tied. 4 years ago, when Eleanor's cancer had progressed to the point where she needed emergency decisions made on her behalf, I signed a temporary, limited medical power of attorney naming Michelle as my agent, not Grant. Michelle, solely for the purpose of making urgent medical decisions if I myself became incapacitated during that specific period of Eleanor's treatment. It expired the day Eleanor's hospice care ended. I know this because I drafted the expiration clause myself, in my own handwriting, on the same afternoon I signed it, because examining expired authority for a living tends to make a man precise about his own paperwork. That document had been dead for 3.5 years. It had no authority over medical decisions, let alone real estate. And it did not name Grant at all. I did not say any of this to Michelle on the phone. I have spent 3 decades learning that when you find the crack in someone's story, you do not point at it immediately. You let them keep walking on it. So I told my daughter I was tired, that we'd talk about it more when I felt stronger, and I hung up the phone. Then I lay in that hospital bed with the ceiling tiles blurring above me, and I felt something in my chest that had nothing to do with the surgery. It was colder than grief. It was the particular focused stillness that used to come over me at my desk, at the county recorder's office, whenever I found a signature that didn't belong on a page. The next call came the following morning, and it came from a stranger. "Mr. Kessler? This is Denise Whitfield. I'm the closing attorney handling the sale of your property on Larkspur Lane. I just wanted to confirm a detail before we finalize Friday's closing. I have paperwork here, listing power of attorney for a Grant Ashford, but I'm showing your deed was re-recorded 18 months ago under a trust instrument, and I'm not seeing the co-trustee's signature anywhere in this file. Can you clarify who your co-trustee is?" I sat up so fast the leads on my chest monitor pulled and the machine let out a short, irritated chirp. A nurse poked her head in, saw I was fine, and withdrew. "Say that again," I told the attorney. She said it again. The deed was under a trust. There was supposed to be a co-trustee signature. It was missing. I want to explain what that meant, because it's the hinge this entire story swings on, and it's not a coincidence that it existed. When Eleanor died, I did something most people don't think to do until it's too late, because I had spent my whole professional life watching families destroy each other over property after a parent's death or decline. I placed the house, free and clear, no mortgage, into a revocable living trust, and because I am a careful man who has seen exactly how a single vulnerable, medicated, grieving old widower can be manipulated by someone he trusts, I named a co-trustee. Not Michelle, not Grant. My oldest friend, Harold Byon, a retired real estate attorney I'd worked alongside for 22 years, a man sharp enough to still catch a fraudulent signature in his sleep. Any sale, any transfer, any refinancing of that trust property required both of our signatures, notarized separately, on record. I built that wall specifically because I understood, in the abstract, professional way you understand fire codes or structural load limits, that vulnerable elderly people get robbed by the people closest to them more often than by strangers. I never thought I'd need it against my own son-in-law. I built the wall anyway. That's what 34 years in the deed room teaches you. You build the wall before the fire, not during it. Grant had found the old, expired, narrowly scoped medical power of attorney in a drawer somewhere, most likely in my house, most likely while I was unconscious in an ICU bed. He'd had it altered or misrepresented its scope, or simply banked on the fact that most people signing closing paperwork on a rushed timeline don't read the fine print of an attached POA closely enough to notice it says medical decisions only and expired in 2022. He'd forged or pressured Michelle into providing a signature purporting to authorize the sale on my behalf, and he had done every single bit of that work without knowing the house he was selling didn't actually belong to Walter Kessler, the individual. It belonged to the Kessler Family Trust, a legal entity with two required signatures, and he only had, or fraudulently produced, one. He had overlooked one signature. Harold's. "Mrs. Whitfield," I said into the phone, and I made myself sound tired and confused, an old man freshly out of heart surgery, because a title examiner learns as much from what he doesn't say as what he does. "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. I never authorized any sale. Can you hold the closing?" "Of course," she said, her voice sharpening with the particular alarm of a professional realizing she's standing near a fraud in progress. "I'll flag the file immediately. I have to say, Mr. Kessler, when I saw the trust structure and only one signature on the authorization, it didn't sit right with me. I've been doing this 11 years. That's not how a properly administered trust closes." I thanked her, hung up, and lay very still in that hospital bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, feeling my heart, the same heart they'd just spent 6 hours repairing, beat steady and sure inside my chest, for what felt like the first time since the surgery. Not because I was relieved, because I was certain. Certainty is a kind of calm that panic can never touch. I want to tell you what I did not do next, because it says something about how you fight a war like this one. I did not call Grant and scream at him. I did not call Michelle and demand answers. I did not press the call button and ask the nurse to bring me a phone book so I could call a lawyer in a fury. Anger is a luxury a man in a hospital bed with a repaired heart cannot afford, both medically and strategically. If Grant knew at this stage that I was aware and alert and paying attention, he would simply pivot, destroy the paper trail, blame a clerical error, send Michelle in to smooth things over with tears and apologies while he quietly tried a different angle. I had caught men like him before, in a different context, across a different desk, and I knew the one rule that mattered above all others. A thief who believes he's still undetected will keep making mistakes. A thief who knows he's caught will stop making mistakes and start covering them. So I did the only thing that made sense to a man who had spent his career letting the paperwork speak for itself. I called Harold. "Walter," he said when he picked up, his voice warm and immediately concerned, because Harold and I had been trading fishing stories and complaining about our knees for over 2 decades, and he knew from the sound of my breathing over the line that something was wrong beyond the surgery. "You sound terrible. What's happened?" "Somebody tried to sell the house," I told him. "Somebody used my old medical POA, the one from Eleanor's illness, and forged or faked their way onto a listing agreement, and they got as far as a closing attorney before they hit your signature line and didn't have anything to put there." The line went quiet for a second. Then Harold, in the flat, dangerous, lawyerly calm I remembered from him arguing title disputes in front of judges who'd learned not to underestimate him, said, "Who?" "Grant," I said. "My son-in-law." Another silence, longer this time. "Walter," Harold finally said, "do you want to handle this quietly, family to family, or do you want to handle it the way we used to handle the real bad ones?" I looked down at my own hand, still faintly bruised from the IV line, resting on the hospital blanket. I thought about Eleanor's garden outside the downstairs window of that house, the one she planted the spring before she got sick. The peonies, she used to say, would outlive both of us if we took care of them right. I thought about the fact that Grant hadn't visited me once in 4 days, while apparently finding plenty of time to walk a realtor through my late wife's bedroom. "Harold," I said, "I want to know exactly how deep this goes before either of us decides anything. Pull every document tied to that closing file, every name. I don't think Grant built this alone. A man with a strip mall real estate office doesn't get a cash buyer lined up and a closing attorney scheduled inside of 4 days on his own." Somebody handed him a fast track. I want to know who. You think there's someone behind him? I think, I said, that in 34 years I never once saw a man move that fast on a property this size without somebody experienced whispering in his ear. Find me the buyer's name first. Harold said he'd have it by morning, and he did, but not before I had one more visitor that same afternoon. One I hadn't expected, and one that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about who was pulling which strings in this scheme. It was almost 6 in the evening, the light through my hospital window gone soft and gray, when the door opened and Michelle stepped in alone. No Grant. She was wearing the kind of exhausted, guilty expression I recognized from her childhood, the one she used to wear right before confessing to something she'd broken. And for a moment, just a moment, I let myself hope that my daughter had come to tell me the truth. She sat down in the vinyl chair beside my bed, twisting the strap of her purse in her hands, and said, "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not be angry until I finish." I said nothing. In 34 years of reading documents for a living, I learned that silence pulls more truth out of a person than any question ever could. Grant didn't do this alone, she said finally, staring at her hands instead of at me. There's a woman, Sabrina Voss. She runs some kind of fast cash real estate fund. I don't fully understand it. Hard money lending, cash buyers, that kind of thing. Grant's been working with her for almost a year on flips. When you had your heart attack, she's the one who told him the house should go on the market immediately, before you recovered enough to object. She said she already had a buyer lined up who could close in days. Dad, I signed something. I don't even remember exactly what. Grant had it on his tablet in the hospital cafeteria. He said it was just a formality so the sale could move while you were still in the ICU, so we wouldn't lose the buyer. I was scared. You'd just had surgery. I thought I was helping. I looked at my daughter, 39 years old, sitting in a hospital chair, confessing to forging her way into her own father's home sale, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with the surgical scar underneath my hospital gown. Not the cold clarity I'd felt reading Denise Whitfield's message. Something rawer. Grief, maybe, for the version of Michelle I'd raised, who I genuinely believed would never sit in a cafeteria signing away her unconscious father's house because a man she was married to told her to hurry. Do you know where Sabrina found this buyer? I asked her, keeping my voice level. Michelle shook her head. Grant just said it was a cash deal, no contingencies, closing this week. He seemed relieved. He kept saying, "This solves everything. This solves everything." Like we were drowning in something I didn't even know about. That phrase sat with me long after Michelle left that evening, promising through tears that she hadn't known the POA was expired, that she'd trusted Grant when he said it was fine, that she loved me and never meant to hurt me. I believed some of that. I did not believe all of it. A woman who signs a legal document at her father's bedside without reading it is not entirely a victim. Even if she is also not entirely a villain, I would need to watch carefully to see which side of that line my daughter chose to stand on once the walls started coming down, because in my experience, the difference between an accomplice and a bystander who becomes an ally is almost always revealed at the exact moment the truth becomes undeniable, and staying silent stops being safe. But that single phrase, "this solves everything," told me something far more important than anything else Michelle had said. It told me Grant wasn't selling my house because he was worried about my recovery, or my stairs, or my grief-stricken solitary rattling around in a 4-bedroom house. He was drowning in something, something that needed solving, fast, with cash, before anyone had time to look too closely. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the dark hospital room listening to the soft rhythm of my own monitor, running the numbers the way I used to run a chain of title, backward methodically, looking for the first weak link. A man doesn't rush a house sale, during his father-in-law's heart surgery because he's being thoughtful. He rushes it because he owes someone, and that someone is no longer willing to wait. The next morning, Harold called back with the buyer's name, and with it, the true shape of the trap Grant had built for himself without ever realizing it was a trap at all. The buyer entity is called Larkview Holdings, LLC, Harold said. Incorporated 11 days ago. No prior business history. Registered agent is a third-party formation service out of Delaware. No listed physical address beyond a UPS store box here in Cleveland. Walter, this has every hallmark of a shell company set up specifically for this transaction. And the funding source. That's the interesting part, Harold said. I pulled the escrow deposit records. Denise was more than happy to cooperate once she understood what she'd nearly closed. The earnest money and the projected purchase funds are being wired from an account held by something called Ridgeline Capital Partners. I made some calls this morning to a couple of old contacts in the AG's Consumer Protection Division. Walter, Ridgeline isn't a bank. It isn't even a licensed lender in this state. It's a private hard money outfit that's been under quiet investigation for 2 years for predatory lending practices bordering on loan sharking. 6-week terms, 30% effective interest, and a habit of seizing collateral the moment a borrower is even a day late. I sat up straighter against my pillows, feeling pieces slide into place the way they used to when I found the one recorded lien that explained an entire messy chain of title. So Grant doesn't just have a business partner, I said slowly. He has a debt. That would be my read, Harold said. A man doesn't sell his father-in-law's paid-off house in 4 days flat unless somebody with very sharp teeth is standing behind him, demanding payment on a very short clock. I looked out the hospital window at the gray Cleveland sky, thinking about my son-in-law sitting somewhere across town, congratulating himself on solving everything, congratulating himself on being smart enough to find a loophole in an old expired document, never once suspecting that the house he thought he'd already sold didn't belong to him, had never belonged to him, and was protected by a signature line he didn't even know existed. He had built his entire desperate plan on top of a foundation with a hole in it exactly the size and shape of my old friend's name. Harold, I said, I want everything documented, every wire record, every signature, every date, and I want to know what Grant actually owes Ridgeline Capital and by when. Because I don't think he's just trying to sell my house to get me into a smaller place. I think my son-in-law is in a hole he can't climb out of, and he decided the fastest shovel he had was mine. What do you want to do once we have it all? Harold asked. I thought about Eleanor's peonies outside that downstairs window. I thought about 34 years spent finding the one broken signature that could unravel an entire fraudulent chain, and how strange and almost merciful it felt that this time, without meaning to, I had built that broken link into my own defense years before I ever needed it. Nothing yet, I said. I want to heal enough to walk out of this hospital on my own 2 feet, and then I want to go home, to my house, Harold, the one that's still legally mine, and I want to be standing in it, in front of everyone, the day Grant finds out exactly what he overlooked. I was discharged from the hospital 9 days after the surgery, on a Tuesday morning with pale sunlight coming through the lobby windows and a folder of prescriptions tucked under my arm. Harold picked me up himself, refusing to let a hospital transport van, or, worse, Grant, be anywhere near that job. He didn't say much on the drive, just glanced at me every few minutes, the way old friends do, when they're checking whether the other man is really as steady as he's pretending to be. I was steadier than I looked. A cracked open chest heals slower than a cracked open heart of a different kind, and mine had been cracking open in a different way for 9 days, hardening into something with edges. We didn't drive straight to Larkspur Lane. I asked Harold to take me to his office first, a converted brick storefront near the courthouse where he still kept a title company running 2 days a week out of habit more than necessity, and we sat together in his back conference room with the blinds drawn and a legal pad between us. And I did what I had done for 34 years professionally and had never once imagined doing to my own family. I built a file. Harold had already pulled the wire records from Ridgeline Capital's escrow account, obtained through a title company contact who owed him a favor from a deal gone sideways a decade earlier. The picture they painted was uglier than either of us had guessed. Grant hadn't borrowed once from Ridgeline. He'd borrowed 3 times over the past 14 months, rolling each loan into the next at increasingly punishing terms, chasing flip properties that had either stalled in renovation or sold for less than projected. The most recent loan, $190,000, due in full 6 weeks from the date it was issued, secured against nothing but Grant's personal guarantee, had come due 4 days before my heart attack. He hadn't paid it. Ridgeline didn't send politely worded default letters. According to 2 separate small claims filings, Harold found buried in the county records from other unlucky borrowers, they sent men to your place of business, and then, if that didn't work, to your home. He's not selling your house to downsize you, Walter, Harold said, tapping the printed loan schedule with one finger. He's selling it to keep himself from getting hurt. I sat with that for a long moment. I am not by nature a vengeful man. 34 years examining title fraud teaches you a certain weary compassion for the desperate people who forge a signature because they're drowning. The widow who alters a deed to keep her house from a predatory nephew. The small business owner who backdates a document because the bank gave him 30 days and he needed 60. I have seen desperation wear 100 faces, and some of them I even understood. But desperation is not the same as entitlement, and what I felt looking at Grant's loan schedule wasn't compassion. It was recognition of a man who had decided at some point in the last 14 months that my paid-off house, my dead wife's garden, and my own unconsciousness in an ICU bed were simply resources to be liquidated in service of his own bad decisions. He hadn't asked me for help. He hadn't come to me, sat across the kitchen table the way a son-in-law might, and said, "Walter, I'm in trouble." He had waited until I couldn't say no, and then he had tried to take what he needed without asking at all. "There's something else," Harold said, sliding a second folder across the table. I did some digging on Sabrina Voss, since her name kept surfacing next to Ridgeline's filings. She's not just a business associate feeding Grant clients. She's on the board of a marketing firm that's done promotional work for Ridgeline's owner directly. And Walter, I hate to bring this up, but you should hear it from me and not from a stranger. My paralegal found a couple of things on social media I think you need to see. He turned his laptop toward me. There were photographs, not many, and not damning on their own. The kind of thing a careless person leaves scattered across a public profile without thinking anyone who mattered would go looking. Grant and Sabrina at a restaurant downtown, her hand resting on his forearm across the table. Grant and Sabrina at what looked like a real estate conference in Columbus, tagged in the same hotel 2 nights running. Nothing explicit. Nothing a divorce attorney couldn't have argued away as business dinners and professional networking. But I had spent 3 decades reading the small details that people didn't think anyone was paying attention to. The initialed margin note, the date that didn't quite match the rest of the document, and I knew what I was looking at. A man doesn't sit that close to a business partner. A man doesn't let a business partner's hand rest on his arm in a lit restaurant where anyone from his life could walk by. I thought of Michelle sitting in that hospital chair, twisting the strap of her purse, saying, "I thought I was helping." I thought about whether she knew, whether some part of her had already sensed what I was looking at on that screen and had chosen, for 9 months or 14 or however long this had been building, not to look too closely, because looking too closely at your own marriage while your father is dying in a hospital bed is a kind of horror most people aren't built to survive twice in one season. Don't show this to Michelle yet, I told Harold. Not until I understand what Grant actually thinks is happening. If Sabrina's using him the way I think she's using him, he doesn't know it. And a man who doesn't know he's being used is more useful to us undisturbed than a man who's just found out and starts making desperate moves in a different direction. Harold looked at me for a long moment, the way he used to look at a client he respected but occasionally worried about. You sound like you're building a case, Walter. I am building a case, I said. I spent 34 years finding the missing signature that unravels the whole chain. Grant handed me his without even knowing it. I intend to use it. We drove to the house that afternoon. I want to tell you what it felt like walking up that front path, past Eleanor's peonies just beginning to bud along the walkway, up the same 3 porch steps I'd carried Michelle up on her first day home from the hospital 39 years earlier, and turning my key in a lock that, thank God, no stranger had thought to change yet, because whatever else Grant had planned, he hadn't planned for the sale to fail before it started, hadn't planned for a title examiner's careful paranoia to survive a heart attack intact. The house was quiet. Nothing had been moved. No moving truck had come. Denise Whitfield's phone call had stopped the machine before it ever got that far, and for that alone I found myself, standing in my own front hallway with my hand still on the doorknob, saying a quiet thank you to a stranger's professional diligence. But something had changed while I was in that hospital bed, and it wasn't the furniture, it was the air. Grant had been inside my house, inside Eleanor's house, searching through drawers for a document that would let him sign away what wasn't his to sign. And even though nothing physical was missing, I felt the violation of it settle into my chest the way the cold had settled in after my surgery. A low ache that wouldn't quite lift. I called the security company that same afternoon, the kind that installs discreet cameras rather than the obvious bubble-domed kind meant to scare off burglars, because I didn't want to scare anyone off. I wanted to see. I had a man come out and place 4 small cameras, one covering the front hallway, one the kitchen, one the living room where Eleanor's reading chair still sat by the window, and one, at my specific and deliberate instruction, covering the study where I kept the old filing cabinet Grant had almost certainly gone through to find that expired power of attorney. I told the technician I'd had a break-in scare and wanted peace of mind. He didn't ask any more questions than that. I paid in cash. I did not tell Michelle I was home. I did not tell Grant. For 6 days I stayed quietly at the house, moving carefully, resting the way my cardiologist insisted I rest, taking my medications on schedule, and watching a small application on my phone that showed me, in grainy but perfectly legible footage, exactly who came and went from a house that was, as far as either of them knew, still sitting empty while its owner recovered somewhere out of sight. On the 3rd day, Grant came by alone. He let himself in with his own key. Michelle had given him 1 year earlier. Back when I still believed a son-in-law having a key to my house was a mark of trust rather than a vulnerability. And I watched on my phone screen, sitting in a rented room above Harold's office because I didn't dare risk being physically present yet, as he walked directly to my study, opened the same filing cabinet drawer, and began photographing documents with his phone. Not the expired POA this time. Something else. I zoomed in as far as the app would allow and recognized, with a slow, cold understanding, the original 1988 deed to the property, the one predating the trust entirely, the one that would have shown him, had he bothered to actually read it instead of photograph it and move on, that the property had already been transferred out of my individual name years earlier. He didn't read it. He photographed it, muttered something to himself. I couldn't make out through the camera's tinny audio and left less than 4 minutes after arriving. The fourth day, it was Sabrina. I recognized her immediately from the photographs Harold had shown me, a tall woman in her mid-40s with the kind of polished, camera-ready presentation that made me think of every predatory salesperson I'd ever watched circle an elderly widow at a title closing, sensing weakness the way a shark senses blood in open water. She didn't have a key. She let herself in through the unlocked side gate and tried the back kitchen door, found it locked, and stood on my patio for a full 6 minutes, making a phone call I could hear with startling clarity through the kitchen camera's microphone, because she stood close enough to the door for the audio to pick her up almost perfectly. "I need this closed by the end of the month," she was saying, pacing a small, tight circle on my patio, near the raised bed where Eleanor used to grow tomatoes. "Ridgeline isn't going to extend again, and if Grant defaults, that's my name on the referral, too. No, listen to me. Once the funds clear, I'm done. I'm not staying tied to a guy who can't even keep his own father-in-law's paperwork straight. This was supposed to be simple." A pause, someone speaking on the other end I couldn't hear. Then Sabrina laughed, a short, humorless sound. "He thinks we're building something together. Let him think that until the wire clears. After that, it's not my problem what he tells his wife." I sat in that rented room with my phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the record button on the app, capturing every second of it, and felt the last piece of the picture lock into place with the same clean, satisfying click I used to feel finding the final document that closed out a fraud investigation. Grant believed he and Sabrina were partners, building something, solving everything, as Michelle had said. Sabrina believed Grant was a liability to be discarded the moment the money cleared. He was betraying his marriage, his wife, and his father-in-law for a woman who was already planning to walk away and let him take the full weight of the fall alone. He thought he was the architect of his own rescue. He was, in fact, the last domino, standing in someone else's collapse, and he didn't even know it yet. I called Michelle that evening. I chose my words carefully, the way I used to choose words when I had to tell a homeowner their deed had a fatal defect, never leading with the wound, always leading with the fact, letting the fact do the cutting on its own. I told her I was feeling stronger, that I wanted to come by the house soon, that I had a few documents I needed her help understanding, since Grant had apparently been handling some paperwork on my behalf. I heard the careful brightness come back into her voice, the same tone from the hospital call, and beneath it, something thinner and more frightened than before. "Of course, Dad," she said. "Whatever you need." "There's something else," I said. "I think we should do something as a family, once I'm back on my feet properly. It's been a hard few months. I'd like to have everyone together. You, Grant, your Aunt Carol, the Hendersons next door who've known us since before you were born. A homecoming, of sorts. A chance for me to thank everyone properly for their support while I was in the hospital." There was a pause on the line, and I could hear, even through the phone, the particular relief of a daughter who believes her father has decided to let the whole ugly business quietly fade rather than blow the family apart. "That sounds wonderful, Dad," she said, and I could hear real warmth returning to her voice, the genuine kind, not the performed kind. "I'll help you plan it. Grant will be so relieved you're not." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, but I finished it silently in my own head, not angry, not suspicious. Not the kind of man who spends 34 years learning exactly how a fraudulent signature moves through a closing file and then somehow forgets everything he ever knew the moment it's his own family holding the pen. I told her I loved her, and I meant it in the same complicated way you can mean it while also knowing that the woman you're speaking to signed away part of your life without reading what was in front of her, and that you are, at this very moment, quietly building the case that will force her to choose, once and for all, which side of this she's actually standing on. I spent the following 2 weeks the way I used to spend the final stretch of a difficult title dispute, patiently, methodically, closing every gap an opposing party might use to escape through later. Harold and I filed the trust paperwork formally with the county, establishing beyond any argument that the property required both signatures, that Grant's submitted authorization was fraudulent on its face, that the medical power of attorney he'd relied on had expired years before Eleanor's death and had never, under any interpretation, extended to real estate transactions in the first place. We compiled the security footage, Grant photographing documents he had no legal right to remove or copy, Sabrina's unmistakable phone call on my own patio, confirming both the fraud and her intention to abandon Grant the moment the money cleared. We pulled the full loan history from Ridgeline Capital, cross-referenced against two other small claims filings from other desperate borrowers who'd learned the hard way what happened when a payment came late. I even, at Harold's suggestion, had a quiet conversation with a detective in the county's financial crimes unit, an old acquaintance from decades of overlapping cases, laying out what we had without yet filing a formal complaint, because I wanted the mechanism ready to spring the moment I chose to pull the trigger, not a moment before. And I watched my daughter. She came by the house twice during those 2 weeks, each time alone, each time a little more subdued than the last, a little quieter, a little more like a woman carrying a weight she hadn't fully named to herself yet. On the second visit, she sat at my kitchen table, the same table where she'd done her homework as a girl, where Eleanor had taught her to make pie crust, where I now sat across from her with a folder of documents I hadn't yet decided whether to show her, and she said without my prompting, "Dad, I think Grant's been lying to me about something. I don't know what. But I found a hotel receipt in his jacket from a trip he told me was a solo work conference, and there were 2 room service charges for dinner." She looked at her hands. I didn't say anything to him. I don't know why. I think I was scared of what he'd say. I looked at my daughter, 39 years old, finally starting to see the crack in the foundation she'd been standing on for months without letting herself look down, and I made a decision that I want to be honest with you about, because it wasn't purely strategic and it wasn't purely paternal. It was both, tangled together the way most real decisions are. I did not show her the footage that night. I did not tell her about Sabrina's phone call on the patio, or Ridgeline Capital, or the 6-week loan with the punishing terms. I told her only this: "Michelle, whatever happens over the next few weeks, I need you to trust me, and I need you to be honest with yourself about what you already suspect, even if you're not ready to say it out loud yet. I love you. That has never once been in question in this whole business. But you're going to have to decide, sooner than you think, which version of this family you actually want to stand inside of." She didn't ask me what I meant. I think by then, some part of her already knew. The homecoming celebration was set for a Saturday, 3 weeks after my discharge, in the backyard of the house on Larkspur Lane, under the same oak tree where I'd married Eleanor 41 years earlier, and where Michelle had married Grant 9 years after that. Michelle handled the planning with an energy that felt, to me, less like joy, and more like a woman trying to outrun a feeling she couldn't yet name. Flowers ordered, a caterer booked, folding chairs rented, 40 invitations sent to neighbors, cousins, old colleagues of mine from the county recorder's office, Harold and his wife, the Hendersons next door, who'd watched Michelle grow up from their own porch. Grant, according to Michelle, was thrilled with the plan. He told her, more than once, that it would be good for everyone to see the family whole again, moving forward, putting the hard months behind them. I let him believe that. I let both of them believe it, right up until the morning of the party, When I sat alone in my study with Harold, the security footage queued on a laptop, the loan documents and the fraudulent authorization forms organized into a single clean folder, and a small speaker cable coiled on the desk in front of me, and I told Harold in the same steady voice I'd used to close out 100 difficult cases across a desk in the recorder's office that it was time to finish what Grant had started. The day he decided my unconscious body in a hospital bed was an opportunity rather than a father. "You're sure," Harold said, "you want to do this in front of everyone? The Hendersons, your colleagues, family that's known you 40 years. I thought of Grant standing in my study 4 days into my recovery, photographing a deed he never bothered to read, congratulating himself on solving everything. I thought of Sabrina on my patio laughing that this isn't my problem what he tells his wife. I thought of Eleanor's peonies blooming along a walkway that had almost been sold to a stranger while I lay unconscious in an ICU bed 12 miles away. A man who tries to steal a house should learn, in front of every witness who ever thought well of him, exactly what he overlooked, I said. Quietly wouldn't teach him anything. It certainly wouldn't teach Sabrina Voss anything. And it wouldn't give Michelle the clean, undeniable truth she's going to need to finally choose the right side of this. Some lessons only stick when they're witnessed. Harold closed the laptop, tucked it under his arm, and looked at me the way he used to look at me across a conference table. Right before we walked into a courtroom, we both already knew we were going to win. "Then let's go throw you a homecoming party, Walter," he said. Grant was arraigned the following Monday on charges of forgery, attempted fraudulent conveyance, and elder financial exploitation, the last of which carries an enhanced sentence in Ohio when the victim is over 65 and recently hospitalized. A detail the assistant prosecutor mentioned to me almost apologetically, as if she expected me to flinch at the word elder being applied to myself. I didn't flinch. I had spent 34 years learning that the law has precise language for precise harms, and what had been done to me while I lay unconscious in a cardiac ward was, in fact, precisely that kind of harm, whether or not I liked the label attached to it. Sabrina Voss faced her own separate reckoning, wider and uglier than the piece of it that touched my family. Once the county's financial crimes unit pulled the thread Harold and I had handed them, it kept unraveling. 3 other flip deals over the past 2 years where she'd steered desperate, over-leveraged small investors toward Ridgeline Capital's predatory terms in exchange for a referral fee, at least one of which had already ended in a foreclosure that displaced an elderly couple in the next county over. She was not, it turned out, a woman who had simply made one mistake with my son-in-law. She was a woman who had built a career out of exactly this kind of mistake, dressed up as opportunity, offered to people too frightened or too proud to say no. Ridgeline Capital's owner was indicted 11 days later on a broader racketeering charge tied to the loan sharking pattern Harold had first flagged for me from his office, and in the months that followed, 3 other borrowers came forward once they saw the case in the local news, each with a story that rhymed uncomfortably with Grant's. A short-term loan, an impossible balloon payment, a piece of property offered up as the only way out. I did not attend Grant's arraignment. I sent Harold in my place, not out of cowardice, but because I had already said everything I needed to say to my son-in-law in my own backyard, in front of 40 witnesses, with my late wife's peonies blooming 20 feet away, and I did not feel the need to say any of it twice. What I did instead that Monday morning was sit at my kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee and wait for my daughter, because Michelle had called the night before, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in weeks, and asked if she could come by in the morning to talk. She arrived a little after 9, without makeup, her hair pulled back plainly, looking younger and more exhausted than I had seen her since she was a teenager staying up all night before a college exam. She sat across from me at the same table where she'd confessed, weeks earlier, to signing something in a hospital cafeteria she never should have signed, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. "I filed for divorce yesterday," she finally said. "I know that's fast. Everyone's going to say it's fast. I don't care. I can't be married to a man who let me sign my own father's rights away because he was too much of a coward to tell me the truth about what he'd done, or about her." "Nobody in this house is going to tell you it's too fast," I said. "Grief doesn't run on anyone else's schedule. Neither does clarity." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug the way her mother used to, a gesture so familiar it made something in my chest ache, in a way that had nothing to do with the surgical scar. "I keep thinking about what you said in the yard," she said, "that I'd have to decide which side of this I wanted to stand on. I think I've known the answer for a while. I think I just didn't want to look at it because looking at it meant admitting I'd let it get that far. That I signed something at your bedside without reading it because it was easier to trust my husband than to protect my father." Her voice cracked on the last few words. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I don't know how to make that right. I have spent a great deal of my professional life believing in the redemptive power of an honest correction, a deed re-recorded properly, a lien released once the debt is satisfied, a chain of title made whole again after decades of small, uncorrected errors. I believe just as firmly in the redemptive power of an honest apology offered without excuse, at a kitchen table with the coffee going cold between two people who love each other and have both made mistakes in a season that asked too much of everyone involved." "You start," I said, "by telling the Financial Crimes Unit exactly what Grant showed you on that tablet in the cafeteria, and exactly what he told you it was for, and exactly what you now understand it actually was. Not to punish yourself. To make sure Sabrina Voss and men like Ridgeline's owner don't get to walk away, because a good and frightened daughter was too ashamed to say what she saw." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "And then, Michelle, you let yourself heal, the same way I'm learning to. Because holding on to shame doesn't undo a signature. It just adds a second wound on top of the first one." She gave her statement to the detectives 2 days later, a full and unflinching account of the cafeteria signing, the tablet, Grant's insistence that it was only a formality, that ultimately became one of the more damning pieces of the prosecution's case against him, precisely because it came from a witness with every incentive to protect him and chose, instead, to protect the truth. Grant took a plea deal 4 months later rather than face trial, once the full weight of the evidence, the forged authorization, the security footage of him photographing documents in my study without authority, the Ridgeline loan records establishing motive, Michelle's own testimony, made a conviction all but certain. He received 3 years, with the possibility of parole after 18 months given his lack of any prior record, and a restitution order covering the legal fees Harold and I had incurred fighting the fraudulent sale. Sabrina Voss, facing the broader racketeering charges tied to Ridgeline, received a longer sentence, and the last I heard, through Harold's contacts rather than through any interest of my own in tracking her, she was still awaiting a second trial on the additional counts tied to the other displaced families her referrals had helped ruin. I did not visit Grant in prison. I have received 2 letters from him since his sentencing, both apologetic, both careful in a way that reads, to a man who spent 34 years reading careful documents for a living, as more concerned with his own record than with genuine remorse for what he did to a father-in-law he'd once called family. I have not replied to either. Perhaps in 3 years or 5, when he's served his time and rebuilt whatever life is left to rebuild, something in him will have changed enough to make a different kind of conversation possible. I am not holding my breath, and I have made a kind of peace with not holding it. Michelle, by contrast, has changed in ways that still catch me by surprise some mornings. She moved out of the house she'd shared with Grant within a month of filing into a small apartment closer to me, close enough that she stops by twice a week now, instead of the once-a-year visits that had somehow become normal in the years since Eleanor died. She started, 3 months ago, volunteering with a legal aid clinic that helps elderly homeowners navigate exactly the kind of predatory lending and fraudulent conveyance schemes that nearly cost me everything, not because I asked her to, but because she told me one evening over dinner at my kitchen table she needed to do something with what she'd learned, needed to turn the worst mistake of her life into something that might stop somebody else's father from waking up in a hospital bed to find his house already halfway out from under him. I used to think being a good daughter meant not making waves. She told me that same evening, pushing food around her plate more than eating it. Not questioning Grant, not questioning the paperwork, just trusting that the people I loved wouldn't hurt me or you. I don't think that's what being a good daughter means anymore. I think it means being willing to look closely at the people you love, even when it's terrifying, especially when it's terrifying, because love isn't the same thing as access. Grant had access to this family for 9 years. He never actually earned the trust that access was built on. I think I confused the two for a long time, and it almost cost you everything. Love isn't the same thing as access. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the months since she said it, turning it over the way I used to turn over a suspicious signature under a jeweler's loupe, looking for the flaw and finding, instead, something closer to wisdom than I expected from a woman still working through the wreckage of her own marriage. It is, I think, the truest thing either of us has said out loud since this entire ordeal began, and it is the sentence I would want carved somewhere permanent. If I were the kind of man who believed in carving sentences into things, the house on Larkspur Lane is quiet again now, the way it was quiet before any of this began, though the quiet feels different to me these days. Not the hollow, echoing quiet of a widower rattling around too much space alone, but something closer to peace, hard-won and carefully protected. Eleanor's peonies bloomed again this spring, right on schedule, the way they have every year since she planted them, indifferent to everything that nearly happened around their roots, while I lay unconscious 12 miles away. I sit on the back porch most evenings now. In the same chair I sat in the morning Denise Whitfield called to tell me about a missing co-trustee signature, and I look out at that garden, and I think about how strange it is that the single most important document I ever drafted in 34 years of examining other people's fraud was one I built quietly for myself, years before I ever imagined needing it, out of nothing more than a careful man's professional habit of expecting the worst from people he loved. Harold still comes by most Sundays, and we still argue amiably about fishing spots and complain about our knees, though our conversations carry a different weight now, the particular closeness of two men who have stood together on the far side of something that could have gone very differently. He tells me, sometimes, that I handled the whole affair with more control than he expected, given the personal stakes involved, and I tell him what I have come to believe is the truest lesson of this whole ordeal, that the people who try to exploit you when you are weakest are almost always betting on the version of you they saw last. The tired old man in the hospital bed, the grieving widower rattling around an empty house, and they almost never account for the version of you that spent a lifetime building quiet, careful defenses against exactly the moment they thought they'd caught you unprepared. Grant saw a man recovering from open-heart surgery and mistook him for a man without any fight left in him. He never once considered that the same meticulous instinct that made me good at my job for 34 years didn't retire when I did. It simply waited, I think often about the moment Denise Whitfield's voice came through my hospital phone, asking me to clarify who my co-trustee was and how close that single phone call came to never happening at all. How easily, if she had been a less careful attorney, or a more rushed one, the sale might have closed before I ever regained enough strength to notice, and I might have woken from my recovery to find the house Eleanor and I built with our own hands already legally gone, sold out from under a family that trusted the wrong people to protect it, while its patriarch slept through the theft of his own legacy. I do not think about that possibility with fear anymore. I think about it instead as a kind of confirmation, proof that the wall I built years before I needed it held exactly as it was designed to hold, that a chain of title with one deliberate broken link, placed there on purpose by a man who understood how fraud actually moves through a family, is stronger than any forged signature a desperate son-in-law can manufacture on his own. Grant overlooked one signature. It was never really about the money, not in the end, not even about the house itself, though I love that house the way you love the only physical place that ever held the whole of a marriage inside its walls. It was about the fact that some people believe love is a kind of leverage, that being let into a family, given a key, trusted with a name at a Thanksgiving table, entitles them to whatever they can quietly take once the people who love them are too weak or too distracted to notice. Grant believed that. Sabrina Voss believed something colder and more calculating, that Grant himself was simply leveraged to be spent and discarded. Both of them were wrong about what family actually protects, and both of them learned, in the end, in front of everyone who had ever trusted them with a smile, exactly how expensive that particular misunderstanding turns out to be. I am 68 years old. My heart carries a set of stitches now that a much younger surgeon assures me are holding up better than expected, and most mornings I believe him, because I wake up steady, and I make my coffee in the same kitchen I have made coffee in for 37 years, and I walk out onto the same back porch and look at the same garden my late wife planted with her own hands, and none of it was sold out from under me, because I built a wall a careless man overlooked entirely. Family. I have come to understand more clearly than I ever did before all of this began, is not a birthright that entitles anyone to unguarded access to everything you have built. It is a trust that has to be earned continuously, examined honestly, and, when necessary, protected with exactly the same careful diligence you would bring to any document that mattered enough to get right the first time. I spent 34 years finding the one broken signature that could unravel an entire fraudulent chain. I never once expected to need that same discipline inside my own family. I built the wall anyway, because that is what a careful man does. And it turned out in the end to be the only inheritance that actually mattered, not the house itself, not the money, but the quiet, patient habit of never signing away or letting anyone else sign away what you have not read all the way to the very last line.